The girl had only asked a passing hunter for help. What she never expected was that the man refused to help her at all. Instead, he took the opportunity to get closer to her and made an even more disturbing demand. A few days later, the girl's boyfriend, Chris, tracked down the hunter's family and came seeking revenge. But what could drive a man to become so cruel and unhinged?
Hurry up!
To understand that, we have to go back a few days earlier. A group of 4 friends had traveled deep into the mountains for a getaway. They planned to spend the day sightseeing and taking photos together. Then something strange happened. Devi suddenly heard the distinct click of a camera shutter.
Okay. Ready?
Confused, he checked his camera. He was certain he hadn't pressed the button. Yet somehow, the sound had come from directly ahead. Alarmed, he looked closer. That's when he realized Chris had stepped on a landmine. Chris immediately froze. None of them could believe it. They had come to the mountains for a simple trip. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the wilderness with a live explosive beneath their friend. For a moment, nobody knew what to do. Alicia broke down in tears, trying to stay calm. Devi told them not to panic. He said he would head down the mountain immediately and find help. With that, he hurried off. But something about his behavior was strange. Instead of heading downhill, he secretly climbed to a nearby ridge. Then, with excitement written all over his face, he pulled out a pair of binoculars. It was almost as if he were waiting for a show to begin. 2 hours passed. Still, there was no sign of Devi. Terrified for Chris's safety, Alicia stood there helplessly, tears welling up in her eyes. But then something even more shocking happened. Daniel suddenly laughed. He casually walked toward Chris and mockingly asked him a question. "Why do you think there would be a landmine out here in the middle of nowhere?" Chris was stunned. Then Daniel slowly turned around and walked into the woods. A short time later, he returned carrying a shovel. Without hesitation, he drove it into the ground. Then he revealed the truth. He was the one who had planted the mine, and the reason for everything was Alicia. For an entire year, Daniel had been trying to win her heart. He believed his devotion would eventually be enough, but he never expected Alicia to fall for Chris. The two had known each other for only a week before they started dating. Unable to accept it, Daniel teamed up with Devi and came up with this twisted plan. At that moment, Chris suddenly spoke up. He insisted the landmine had to be fake. Daniel smirked. Then he reached down and ripped out the mine's safety pin. With a grin, he delivered a chilling response. It wasn't going to explode before. Now it will. Seeing Alicia continue to beg for Chris, Daniel instantly lost his temper. In a fit of rage, he hurled the safety pin down the mountainside. Chris's face immediately turned pale, but Daniel couldn't have cared less. His goal had already been achieved. Throwing on his backpack, he turned and walked away without looking back. Yet he didn't go very far. Instead, he met up with Devi nearby, and the two prepared to leave together. Now only Chris and Alicia remained on the mountain. Alicia was overwhelmed with panic. She had no idea what to do. Chris, however, begged her to leave. He could already feel his strength fading. The last thing he wanted was for Alicia to get hurt because of him. But Alicia refused to abandon him, determined to save the man she loved. She insisted she would find a way out. Not long afterward, she managed to find the missing safety pin farther down the slope. Carefully, she returned to Chris's side and slowly knelt beside him. But when she tried to put the pin back into place, something was wrong. It felt as though the opening had been deliberately blocked. No matter how hard she tried, the pin simply wouldn't go back in. With no other option, Alicia began searching for another solution. As Chris struggled to remain perfectly still, she grabbed the shovel once again. Then she started digging a hole behind him. If the mine exploded, their only chance might be to dive into the pit before the blast, and hope it would give them a chance to survive. But just then, a black dog suddenly came charging out of the woods, trying to protect Chris. Alicia grabbed the shovel and desperately tried to drive it away. Moments later, the dog's owner, Ilya, arrived carrying a hunting rifle. Seeing Alicia with the shovel, he immediately assumed she was trying to hurt his dog. Without hesitation, he raised his gun and aimed it at both of them. Alicia tried her best to explain the situation, but Ilya didn't believe a word of it. Instead, he became convinced they were trying to bury a body in the mountains. The more he talked, the more agitated he became. Only after Alicia continued explaining did he finally begin to calm down. Even then, after looking at the landmine beneath Chris's foot, Ilya remained skeptical. He claimed he had been walking this trail for decades. If there had really been a landmine here, he would have encountered it long ago. Still, Chris and Alicia didn't seem to be lying. Wanting to find out the truth, Ilya quietly picked up a rock from the ground. Then he walked over to Chris. Without warning, he suddenly hurled the rock at him. Chris didn't move an inch. Only then did Ilya finally relax. Realizing the danger was real, he quickly apologized. Alicia thought she had finally found someone willing to help. She immediately asked Ilya to help dig a protective pit, but instead of helping, Ilya saw an opportunity for personal gain. Reluctantly, the couple handed over the belongings from their backpacks. To their surprise, Ilya began digging through their things and eventually pulled out one of Alicia's undergarments. Yet even that wasn't enough to satisfy him. Soon, he began making even more disturbing demands. Terrified, Alicia backed away, but Ilya slowly moved closer. Before long, he began touching her without permission. At that moment, Chris shouted for him to stop. Desperate, he offered all the cash and bank cards he had on him, but Ilya no longer cared about money. What he wanted was Alicia's personal belongings. Watching his girlfriend continuously harassed, Chris could barely contain his anger, yet he didn't dare move. All he could do was shout and curse and protest. Unfortunately, his outburst only angered Ilya. Furious, Ilya stormed over and threatened Chris. Despite his rage, Chris had no choice but to stay silent. Alicia eventually agreed to comply with Ilya's demand. She turned and started walking toward the tent, but Ilya immediately stopped her. He insisted she do it outside where he could see.
Shut the fuck up.
Doing this.
Humiliated, Alicia forced herself to comply. Then she begged him once again to help save Chris. Just then, Ilya's radio suddenly crackled to life. Seeing that he had a way to contact the outside world, Alicia was overwhelmed with hope. She begged him to let her use the radio to call for help, but Ilya had no intention of giving up such an opportunity. Instead, he made another degrading demand. He seemed determined to satisfy his own twisted desires. Then he tossed Alicia's belongings into the distance and ordered her to retrieve them. This time, Alicia refused. She would rather continue digging the pit herself than allow Ilya to keep humiliating her. But Ilya wasn't in a hurry. He simply sat nearby and waited. Before long, the rocky ground left Alicia exhausted. Desperate to save Chris, she finally gave in.
You got a thing for the dog? Is that what it is?
I'll bring to you.
She walked over, retrieved the item, and handed it back to Ilya, but he still wasn't satisfied. He told her she had to bring it back like a dog. Alicia's face filled with humiliation, yet by this point, she felt she had no choice. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground. Then she crawled forward and followed his instructions. When she brought it back again, Ilya demanded even more. He insisted she imitate a dog's movements completely. Once again, Alicia crawled toward the item. To make matters worse, Ilya deliberately sent the black dog to carry it away. Nearby, Chris watched helplessly. The hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. Yet there was nothing he could do except watch as his girlfriend endured one humiliation after another. Fortunately, Ilya finally stopped pushing things further. At last, Alicia was allowed to use the radio. For a moment, she thought rescue was finally within reach, but when she tried communicating, she discovered the person on the other end couldn't understand English. The conversation went nowhere. Alicia felt hope slipping away once again. With no other option, she begged Ilya to translate for her. To her surprise, he immediately agreed, but only on one condition. He wanted to play a game. For every sentence he translated, Alicia would have to remove one piece of clothing. The demands had become unbearable. This time, Alicia refused outright, but things were no longer under her control. Her repeated compromises had only encouraged Ilya. Before she could resist, he forced her to the ground and made her participate in the degrading game. As time passed, she was left with almost nothing. Finally, Alicia refused to continue, but Ilya wasn't finished. He raised his rifle and threatened her into further compliance. Behind them, Chris shouted continuously, doing everything he could to distract him. The tactic worked. Ilya turned his attention toward Chris. Seizing the opportunity, Alicia suddenly took off running. By now, Ilya was completely enraged. Without thinking, he immediately chased after her. What he failed to realize was that in his haste, he had left the rifle behind. At that critical moment, Chris grabbed a nearby chain, then he removed the buckle from his belt and tied the pieces together. Using the improvised hook, he managed to pull the rifle toward himself, but just as the weapon reached his hands, Ilya returned. This time, he was dragging Alicia with him. Seeing Chris holding the rifle, Ilya showed no fear whatsoever. Instead, he became even more arrogant. He knew Chris wouldn't dare pull the trigger, and unfortunately, he was right. Afraid of hitting Alicia, Chris kept the rifle raised but couldn't bring himself to shoot. Seeing his hesitation, Ilya grew even bolder. He dragged Alicia behind a large rock.
Come on.
Then, right in front of Chris, he continued tormenting her. Heartbreaking screams echoed through the valley. Chris could do nothing but watch. Every second felt unbearable. His heart was breaking, yet he was completely powerless to stop it. Several minutes later, Ilya finally stopped. Alicia immediately looked for a chance to break free, and at last, Chris saw an opportunity to take the shot. In the chaos, Chris lost consciousness. Through the haze, he thought he saw Ilya standing before him, holding the landmine. Mocking him, Ilya laughed at the fact that he had been trapped for so long by what was nothing more than a fake mine. Then he grabbed their backpacks and walked away. When Chris finally regained consciousness, he turned his head and saw Alicia lying beside him, covered in blood. Only then did he realize the horrifying truth. In the confusion, the person he had shot wasn't Ilya at all. It was Alicia. Overwhelmed with grief, Chris screamed for help into the empty wilderness, but Alicia was already gone. A month later, Chris returned to the mountains. This time, he tracked down Ilya's home, unaware of who he really was. Ilya's wife and daughter welcomed him warmly. When Ilya finally returned home, he assumed an ordinary guest had arrived, but the moment he recognized Chris, he froze. Cold sweat instantly covered his face. For the first time in his life, he experienced genuine fear. Without hesitation, he ordered Chris to leave. Before he went, Ilya issued a stern warning. If Chris ever came back, he would call the police. Although Chris appeared to leave peacefully, Ilya couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Soon afterward, he released his black dog, hoping it would track Chris down, but 2 hours passed, and the dog never returned. Growing increasingly uneasy, Ilya went outside to investigate. What he found sent a chill through him. There was blood on the ground, but no sign of the dog, and no sign of Chris. Panic immediately set in. Ilya sprinted back toward the house. Just as he feared, Chris had already entered the property. The black dog lay nearby, barely alive. Without thinking, Ilya rushed toward the storage room to retrieve his rifle. At that moment, Chris calmly stepped out of another room. Surprisingly, he showed no fear of the weapon pointed at him. Instead, he slowly continued walking forward. The reason soon became clear. Chris had already removed every round from the rifle. Then he ordered Ilya's wife and daughter to take him back inside. From that moment on, Chris's revenge truly began. Smiling faintly, he pulled out a pair of zip ties. He instructed the daughter to restrain her mother's hands and feet. Ilya knew something terrible was about to happen. Desperate, he repeatedly apologized. He claimed that on that day in the mountains, he had been drunk and had acted foolishly. He begged Chris not to involve his innocent daughter. Whatever punishment was coming, he said he alone deserved it. Chris listened in silence. His expression never changed. Then he turned around and picked up a bottle of liquor. Without saying a word, he took a long drink. Afterward, he forced both the mother and daughter, Lika, to take a drink as well. According to Chris, that settled everything between them. Now it was time for a game. He pulled Lika forward. Then he began recreating parts of the psychological torment that had once been inflicted on Alicia. The roles had completely reversed. The former victim had become the aggressor, and the former aggressor's family now found themselves powerless. But this was only the beginning.
No! No! What? Drag him.
Chris then forced a personal belonging of Lika's into Ilya's mouth. Only then did he finally reveal everything. He described, in detail, what had happened in the mountains years earlier. For the first time, Ilya's wife and daughter learned the truth. The man they had trusted and admired for years was far different from the person they believed him to be. By now, Ilya was completely broken. Tears streamed down his face. Again and again, he begged for forgiveness. Again and again, he pleaded with Chris to spare his daughter. He insisted he alone should bear the consequences, but his words came too late. Suddenly, Chris remembered how much Ilya had enjoyed manipulating people, so he decided to create a cruel game of chance. He emptied the rifle, then he loaded a single round. Afterward, he explained the rules to Lika. Each time she complied with one of his commands, he would pull the trigger. If luck was on her side, nothing would happen, but Lika was frozen with fear. She couldn't move. Growing impatient, Chris pulled the trigger once. Click. Nothing. Then he pulled it again. Another empty chamber. For the moment, she survived. Nearby, her mother squeezed her eyes shut in terror. Ilya remained on the floor, begging desperately for mercy, but no one listened. Consumed by grief and rage, Chris could no longer think clearly. When Lika still refused to move, he pulled the trigger again. Within moments, several chances had already passed. Finally, overwhelmed by fear, Lika gave in. Under the devastated gaze of her parents, she slowly obeyed. Chris immediately pulled the trigger once more. This time, the shot rang out.
Hurry up! She's girl 3.
As Lika collapsed to the floor, something inside Chris finally broke. The revenge he had pursued for so long was complete. Yet he felt no satisfaction, none at all. He stared at the innocent young woman lying motionless on the ground. Around him, Ilya and his wife cried out in unbearable grief. Chris stood frozen, lost, confused. For the first time, he no longer knew whether anything he had done could truly be called justice. Ilya's crimes had been unforgivable, but Lika had been innocent from the very beginning, and from that moment forward, Chris would have to live with that reality. For the rest of his life, he would carry the weight of guilt, regret, and sorrow.